We focused on everything over $10 million, verdicts against trucking companies that were $10 million or higher. And we pulled together a data set of over 600 truck-involved crash cases to do our analysis. Specifically looking at nuclear verdicts, those that are $10 million or higher, we've seen a near doubling in the number of cases just in our data set of over 600 cases with verdicts over $10 million. We did such a deep dive on the crash data and on the court cases that we can tell you, for instance, if your truck was involved in a crash that involved the vehicle spinning or rolling, you're going to see a much higher verdict size than you would if it is a sideswipe. When children were involved in a crash, we saw an average verdict size of $42 million against the trucking fleet, versus those where no children were involved, where it was just over $2 million. Certainly, a trucking fleet cannot control whether there are children involved in the crash or not, but knowing what they are potentially up against in the courtroom is powerful information for the trucking fleet, for their defense counsel, and for their insurer in terms of determining whether they should settle or take it to court. Whatever the cause is that led to that crash has an impact on the verdict size. We saw several causal factors where, for instance, the driver was on their cell phone, or where the driver left the scene of the crash or failed to call 911, where 100% of the verdicts went in favor of the plaintiff. But what really impacts the trucking industry are those small verdicts and settlements. We pulled together a data set that included both verdicts and settlements of less than $1 million to do the same type of analysis. What causal factors were involved, what led to a verdict versus a settlement, and what we found is that settlement amounts were typically 37% higher than verdict amounts. What we hypothesize is that insurers prefer to settle up front rather than risk taking a case to court where they are then subject to what the jury decides and often leading to much higher amounts.
We studied hundreds of these cases, and what we discovered is the trial lawyers, the plaintiff attorneys, are very consistent in their approach. They have certain things they look for at a motor carrier after an accident, after a crash happens. They rush in and they start looking for gaps in compliance programs, in hiring practices, in safety, in risk, in all the things that motor carriers have to do in keeping up with the federal safety regulations. And that's what they exploit at trial, and that's what inflames the jury. They convince the jury that this is a motor carrier that doesn't care. They're not worried about safety. They're only out for profit. They don't pay attention to even the most basic of regulations, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and that inflames the emotions. That is the reptile theory, is that the old reptile brain, the theory tells us, motivated by self-preservation and safety, and reacts very strongly and in a very punitive way when it feels threatened. That's the goal of the trial lawyers, is to get to that point, to show a systemic disregard for safety, and here comes the big awards. So the data we gather is to close those gaps, to make sure they're doing the things they should be doing and beyond, and that then becomes a defensive wall. When these plaintiffs come in, the story they run into is, actually, let me tell you about what this motor carrier actually does in their commitment to safety. And it diffuses that emotional response. There's two main silos of data we think about. The public data, all the data gathered by the FMCSA and all of their law enforcement partners around the country, all of the roadside inspections and the traffic stops for commercial motor vehicles, every single one of those creates data about that truck, that driver, and the trucking company that owns the vehicle and employs the driver. Then the second silo is that internal data, the data that's generated by the ELD devices in the cab, by the cameras they may have installed, by their back office applications like driver qualification platforms, the pre-hiring they're doing, background checks, are they running PSP reports? Those are all the things that we gather. Think of it as almost evidentiary data of compliance and best practices that can be used to build this defensive wall. We actually end up with a score. We have a reptile theory index that comes out of this. This is where the industry must move together. We need to create a movement. We think that can be accomplished if the industry aligns behind Blue Wire's strategy and directly focuses on these gaps that are identified in the reptile theory.